Greetings to all colleagues. I feel greatly honored by the decision of the Odisha Economic Association for this award. I must confess that when Professor Manoj Panda sent me this proposal, I was greatly surprised. I've never taught or been a researcher in any of the higher educational institutions or universities in Odisha. My writings in Odisha's mediums have been mostly newspaper articles. I presume I am honored because I am an ODIA scholar. Thank you for the honor. As I think back about my scholastic life, I realize that economics is essentially an empirical discipline which tries to understand the hows and whys of the society's economic organization. The normative and prescriptive values are not an intrinsic part of this discipline. They come out of independent human rational thinking, which is the source of all human values. I remember that I began my professional work faced with a lot of village level data collected by a senior who had left without any statement about why these data had been collected. As I began to think of the rural scene and the analytical propositions relating to it I had been faced with in my MA class, I was suddenly asked to read and comment on the district monographs of the Rural Credit Survey of the Reserve Bank of India. These were reports which had a clearly specified purpose laid down in broad detail. So, reacting to these was straightforward. It was a very useful training for me. It prepared me to read the relevant literature and write my PhD dissertation, which incidentally made me familiar with most of the literature on the Indian rural economy available at that time. However, my learning of basic economic theory in the University of Chicago, some 7 years after I had passed MA, made me think about the relevance of logic of economic analysis for raising questions about proper economic use of resources for the best outcome. The Friedmanian orientation of most, if not all, teaching there, in spite of its very right-wing orientation of social values, was basically empirical. I tried my hand there to see and show the unirrigated farms in peninsular India did respond to changes in relative prices, though the response was so low that it understandably gave the impression to some that the dryland farmer in India was not responsive to price changes. This logico-empirical approach led me to study the impact of food grains under Public Law 480 from the USA. It had an unfavorable impact on Indian agriculture. Fortunately, the government of the day introduced price support program at the time the new high-yielding wheat and rice were being introduced in India. This led me to show with empirical data available that it is meaningless to advocate fixing support price on the basis of estimated cost of production, however calculated. Subsequently, I proposed the calculation of terms of trade for individual crops in different states with reference to a good year in the past as the basis for the support price. Ad hoc adjustments in this by the government would land the economy and the government in trouble. During the planning era in India, very detailed sample surveys into different aspects of the rural and urban economy were undertaken, which opened up opportunity for scholars to not only use these for the specific purpose for which they were collected, but also for many other uses that the user could think of. I used the consumer expenditure data collected by the National Sample Survey Organization for estimation of rural and urban poverty in different states of India. The study carried out by Professor Dandekar and me started with the simple notion that at that time, those in India who could not get 2 square meals a day for 365 days in the year were poor. And the notion of 2 square meals was translated into calories on the basis of nutritional study by Professor P.V. Sukhatme. The study led us to the conclusion that under the prevailing situation, a public policy of employment in public works was the most appropriate measure to help the rural poor rise above poverty. Later on, I found that the IRD program of the government was not effective in this task. However, except for the government of Maharashtra, the Planning Commission took nearly 30 years to implement such an employment program for the country as a whole. I may mention here that some of the very detailed large-scale sample surveys in the country have not been used adequately by scholars. The cost of production surveys into large number of sample farmers every year were not used by economists for any other purpose except for the calculation of average cost of production of crops. I use these data to estimate the extent of disguised unemployment in agri households, which turned out to be very high. This was half a century back. I presume it might have declined by now, adding to the extent of open unemployment, but these data are likely to be very useful for certain other purposes. I had the opportunity of working in a few government-appointed committees to inquire into certain aspects of the economy. The review of land reform laws in Maharashtra led us to the conclusion that ending tenancy in farmland for small landowners was an unhelpful proposition, mainly because it prevented outmigration of workers for non-farm jobs, which was becoming growingly necessary. The other committee work led to the estimation of the extent to which social infrastructure in rural areas had been carried out by the government. It turned out that nearly 40% of the villages in Maharashtra had no all-weather roads linking them to the nearest highway, had no primary schools, had no access to primary health centers, etc. by 1983, that is 30 years after planning. This had a very negative impact on the basic well-being of the rural populace, on their ability to rise in economic life, in creating opportunity for local entrepreneurs to open enterprise, small and medium. The committee recommended a method by which discretionary decisions about investment in such works would be avoided. I had a similar calculation for Odisha as a member of the Odisha Planning Board in the first half of the 1990s. But neither Maharashtra nor Odisha government accepted the recommendation. Later, in a paper, I pointed out that the terrible social and economic situation that the country has been witnessing since the middle of the 1960s is a consequence of this signal failure by the Indian Planning Commission. This and proper decentralization of administration appear to be absolutely necessary for such development. Ever since I came back from Chicago, I was teaching a course in basic price theory while doing my research in rural economy. While teaching, it occurred to me to point out that in equilibrium, the fixed or the smallest factor of production would have the highest average product, something that is never drawn attention to. When one of my PhD students showed me his draft on his inquiry into a lift irrigation study, I suggested this to him in order to try out a more economic use of the given quantity of water. He did it and came with the result that the best use of that quantity of water would be in supplying the water to seasonal crops, mainly seasonal millets, pulses, oilseeds, then to sugarcane, to which water was being given. The result led me to propose a research scheme in a large-scale irrigation project in Maharashtra. The result was revealing. Data clearly showed that supplying water to seasonal millets, pulses, oilseeds, cotton would lead to more than doubling the area under irrigation, doubling the total income from the same quantity of irrigation water, benefits to a much larger number of farmers, and employment of a much larger body of family workers and hired labor than the sugarcane-based irrigation. The data and the conclusions were never contested. The question raised by us, not others, was, why are farmers not interested in this use pattern? The answer was simple. An acre of sugarcane takes a volume of water that would suffice the irrigation of 10 acres of millets or other seasonal crops. But in the flow irrigation projects, there were very few farmers who had more than 5 acres under command of this scheme. They will stand to lose if water is diverted to non-sugarcane crops. For them, the land, not water in the project area, was in short supply. It is a matter of conflict of social and private interest. The recommendation has never been accepted, though no one questions the logic of the finding. I do not wish to speculate what will happen and when. When I was working on this, I was painfully aware that this line of reasoning had not occurred to me when I was working on the Hirakud Dam project in the 1950s. I should have advocated water courses from minors to fields covering about, say, 20 acres instead of the flooding method for irrigating fields. This would have facilitated providing fixed quantity of water to every plot and water to seasonal non-cereal crops. The Bahal lands should have been left without water courses, but required to be served by wells or shallow tube wells for farmers who thought of supplementary irrigation of their paddy crop. I wrote newspaper articles on the subject much later, but to no effect. I did a calculation of the costs and benefits of the proposal to link rivers in India mainly to provide water to the water-short regions of peninsular India. It showed that the cost of water to even a seasonal crop would be fantastic. The alternative scheme of use of canal water for seasonal crops in peninsular India, advocated by me above, would be a far better way of using the water resources of the country. But though uncontested, it never drew any reactions from the concerned quarters. Friends, as I approach my 95th year, I realize a lot of work can be done on the Odisha economy, indeed of every state economy. I am not thinking of new fact-finding surveys, but use of available survey data. It's a great pity that the Government of India is not permitting conduct and publication of such surveys in recent years. But a lot of work, I feel, is possible with already published data. The Statistical Bureau of Odisha government has been carrying out a detailed inquiry every year since 1981 in 20% of the randomly selected villages of the state for information plot-wise. The data shows steadily declining area under cultivation in the state. This needs investigation and analysis. Since 2000, the National Sample Survey Organization has carried out the survey at 6-year intervals into household income of agricultural families. The data show that Odisha is the state with the lowest household income from agriculture, and it is declining since 2002 till 2018. What is more, its income from agriculture is lower than from wages. This is something that needs analysis. This can be helped by the annual investigation data of the Bureau referred to above. The spread of irrigation, the use of manures and fertilizers can be investigated with the available data. There are many questions that can be raised and answers sought. Diversification in agriculture is another aspect that needs looking into. It's not as if the Odia farmer is completely silent, but what needs investigation is the circumstance preventing quick adoption of good examples. It's not only agricultural development, or rather the lack of it. Rural areas need opening up for small, medium, non-farm enterprises. The periodic economic census which was being carried out has not been repeated after 2017. Even the report of 2017 census is not published. These data would show the changing situation and point in directions that would need investigation and analysis. Spread of different types of crops need and will facilitate location of appropriate processing units. This, besides the processing units for household needs, which are slowly opening up, location of industrial units in rural and semi-urban areas to supply needs of larger factories is another possibility. Studies show that such units in India are not all in the neighborhood of the large factories. Opening up of the villages with all-weather roads and electricity may facilitate location of such units. And data show the possibility of locating such units in villages on non-farm lands. I can go on, but must stop listing what I cannot do now. Economic development, meaning greater spread of economic well-being, I think, requires large-scale investment in creating social infrastructure, not privatization and insurance. In this context, the privatization of channels for mobile telephones and email facility run the risk of emergence of monopoly. There are parties with deep pockets who will sooner than later monopolize these and many other sectors of the economy. What is necessary is creating a public sector channel of broadband message carrying facility which various service providers can hire for their use. Failure in this matter will lead to serious socio-political and economic consequences. I can at this stage do no better than quote from a signal study by a distinguished historian into the East India Company, the world's oldest and most outstanding joint stock company. And I quote, "The East India Company remains today history's most ominous warning about the potential for abuse of the corporate power and the insidious means by which the interest of shareholders can seemingly become those of the state. For, as recent American adventures in Iraq have shown, our world is far from post-imperial and quite probably never will be. Instead, empire is transforming itself into forms of global power that use campaign contributions and commercial lobbying, multinational financial systems and global markets, corporate influence and predictive data harvesting of the new surveillance capitalism rather than or sometimes alongside overt military conquest, occupation, or direct economic domination to effect its ends. 400 years, 420 years after its founding, the story of the East India Company has never been more current. Unquote. Friends, I must stop. I am greatly obliged to you for the award and this gracious opportunity to share my recollections with you. Sorry, as I was coming to the end of my little speech, I suddenly realized that this is more appropriately a talk for the senior students of economics from an old retiring teacher than to seasoned teachers and researchers of economics. Pardon me, it's too late.